So let me tell you what I think of cruelty. Cruelty, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is a disposition to inflict suffering. It's also to delight in or be indifferent to the pain or misery of others, to act in a merciless, hard-hearted fashion, and so on. This common sense definition provides a binary constellation. On the one hand, we have an actor who inflicts suffering, and someone who, or something that, suffers because of the actor's actions. Not every perpetrator, however, is cruel. Perpetration and cruelty are not synonymous. A perpetrator can commit a violent act without the victim suffering, as when someone places a bomb that upon explosion instantaneously kills people. The victims of the bombing were killed, but did not suffer. Of course, other people may suffer because of it, but the victims, the immediate victims themselves, did not suffer. So on one hand, cruelty involves suffering. On the other, it also implies intention or indifference. In the OED, it says that the perpetrator can delight in or be indifferent to the suffering of the victim. But is the perpetrator's indifference to the suffering of the victim a sufficient condition for cruelty? In the world of non-human animals, beasts of prey are torn apart and eaten alive by predators. For animals of prey, a common manner of death is being killed by being eaten. Their suffering is often unbearable to watch. In preparation for this paper, I actually did watch some of the videos that are out there, and I can assure you, at least for me, they were very difficult to watch. Sometimes the prey animals lie helpless in agony for hours as their flesh is ripped from their bodies and their intestines are pulled out and devoured. But do lions and hyenas, bears and wolves commit cruel acts because they apparently are indifferent to the suffering of their prey? The question becomes even more tangled when factoring in that predators or predation is more than a simple uptake of nutrition. For predatory mammals, the so-called pain-blood-death complex, there's actually such a thing as the pain-blood-death complex in biology, which involves the prey's terror and struggles to escape as it is brought down, the shedding of its blood and its vocalizations as it is wounded and eaten, often while it's still alive. This is a quotation from an article by a biologist. In biochemical terms, this pain-blood-death complex is a matter of sexual arousal and pleasurable reward, even before satiation. In other words, for the predator, the drive behind the pain-blood-death complex is not rage and not even just hunger, but pleasure. Even with this knowledge, it would be problematic to call non-human predators cruel. It seems that cruelty involves an element of choice, that is, that the perpetrator has the choice to not torment the victim, that the inflicting of suffering is a voluntary act by the perpetrator. This assumption, however, leads to more questions. What is meant by volition? Is human cruelty not just a matter of biochemical rewards, just like in other animals? Are human beings essentially different from other animals due to their ability to make rational choices? Or are human beings as much victim to their urges as other predators? To find answers to these questions, we must venture into the temples of various disciplines and rob a chalice here and an ornament there, and we may not return from the raid with an unambiguous definition of cruelty. Rather, the foray could be considered a goal in itself, as it offers an occasion for further discussion on alternative images of the human. The first temple we reach is devoted to Ionemia, one of the Horai, and the goddess of the polis and its legal order. For our purpose, the temple can be said to contain sacred objects of political philosophy. One of those is a definition of cruelty by Judith Shklar, a political theorist, who writes that cruelty is the willful inflicting of physical pain on a weaker being in order to cause anguish and fear. A few years later, she elaborates that cruelty is the deliberate infliction of physical and secondarily emotional pain upon a weaker person or group by stronger ones in order to achieve some end, tangible or intangible, of the latter. In both definitions, cruelty is not just a matter of deliberately inflicting pain, it is also an issue of power and rationality. The stronger torments the weaker, and the stronger does so in order to achieve an end. The structural superiority of the stronger can, of course, be both a precondition for and an effect of cruelty. So, in other words, depends on the situation, but in the cruel moment, it is who does what to whom and for what purpose which seems to define strength and weakness, or perpetration and victimhood. Sklar considers cruelty to be the greatest of all evils. Now, she was a liberal philosopher, so liberalism, according to Sklar, is the refusal to follow Machiavelli's advice to commit cruel acts for the sake of public benefit. That's one of his key tenets, Machiavelli, that is. The American philosopher Richard Rorty extends Sklar's definition by arguing that liberals abhor cruelty without feeling the need to justify this sentiment. As he puts it, for liberals, quotation, there is no answer to the question, why not be cruel? End of quote. Finding cruelty repugnant and intolerable is its own justification. Trying to explain why cruelty is the ultimate evil would be to search for a foundation, which is something Rorty claimed not to believe in. And I guess this is also something that many anthropologists would find difficult to come up with, a kind of foundation for why we abhor cruelty. Rorty wrote that liberals like himself are aware that the language of their moral deliberation is contingent, that their morality is Freudian, that is conditional in nature, that they are entangled in the webs of a cultural community, and that their commitment to this community is contingent as well. The liberal spends her time worrying about the possibility that she has been initiated into the wrong tribe, as Rorty puts it. Rorty's commitment to liberalism was an historical accident, but one which he cherished. From this follows that the liberal aversion to cruelty is just as accidental. Now let's hurry on to the next temple, which seems to belong to Chronos, the god of time, but apparently he shares the temple with Prometheus, who brought burning light to the human species. Historically, the political philosophy of liberalism emerged from the liberation movement known as the European Enlightenment. The latter, according to Immanuel Kant, it's probably one of its major prophets, is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. The goal is self-knowledge and self-reliance, which can only be achieved through self-liberation. Now, what if one took Kant's invitation literally and broke free from social conventions and moral restrictions for the sake of self-liberation, all out, so to speak, a complete self-liberation? The question then is, if it was Donatien Alphonse François, Count of Sade, known as the Marquis de Sade and later as Citoyen Sade, or the Citizen Sade, who most perfectly embodied the spirit of the European Enlightenment. What if the sort of emergence from self-incurred maturity, or immaturity, which Kant wrote about, leads to the ruthless instrumentalization of all others, and ultimately to Auschwitz? One of Sade's more outrageous literary incarnations is Juliette, the cruel, criminal, sexually indiscriminating heroine of the novel that bears her name, Histoire de Juliette ou les prospérités du vice, the story of Juliette or the rewards of vice. Sade had already published a novel before that called Justine ou les malheurs de la vertu, Justine or the misfortunes of virtue. Justine and Juliette are sisters and one another's opposites. While Justine tries to remain virtuous, which only brings her ill luck, Juliette wallows in vice, which earns her ample rewards and success. That's, of course, the Sadean universe. Early on, Juliette is taught that she must follow the principle of de s'amuser sans se soucier aux dépens de quiconque, to have a good time without a care at the expense of whomever. She witnesses and takes part in everything from sexual orgies and torture to murder and cannibalism. She inflicts pain on and victimizes others in the spirit of l'art pour l'art. Long enough have human beings killed one another out of rage and necessity. It is time to kill for the sake of aesthetic enjoyment and with a sense of taste, says Stade. Sadism, then, is not cruelty in Sklar's sense, because she defines cruelty as being a means to an end, but Stade wants cruelty to be its own end. In a chapter entitled Juliette oder Aufklärung und Moral, Juliette or Enlightenment and Morality, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, the founders of the Frankfurt School in Sociology and Political Philosophy, refused to see Juliette in Freudian terms as a victim of an unsublimated or regressed libido. Instead, they take her appreciation of cruelty to be purely intellectual. Amor intellectualis diaboli, the joy of defeating civilization with its own weapons. Juliette, on this view, acts in the spirit of enlightened self-mastery. By freely choosing to act upon and enact her inclinations, Juliette demonstrates how the autocratic subject, that is the ideal of the Enlightenment, subjugates nature, and how this may not lead to morality in the conventional sense, but to immoral cynicism, and ultimately to Auschwitz. Sade's literary characters are often preposterously impervious to physical and mental change. Whatever is done to virtuous Justine, for instance, she seems invulnerable and completely incapable of learning. Despite repeated abuse, her body remains intact and her mind fixed in an original state of ignorance and innocence. When Horkheimer and Adorno suggest that her sister Juliette's cruelty is purely irrational, they, I think, too create an improbable character. Granted that volition ought to be considered a defining feature of cruelty, but to argue that there can be a human being who is entirely disconnected from her unconscious is a literary fiction not supported by our knowledge of human biology. We finally arrive at a temple devoted to the polis and to anthropos, to the state or society and human beings. Is cruelty the product of biological evolution, of which human evolution is one aspect? Or can cruelty be a purely rational and voluntary act of self-liberation? Human history is certainly rife with cruelty. Still prevalent is the everyday cruelty of child abuse, wife beating, animal baiting, and so on. Infamous are the Roman, medieval, and modern carnivals of death. Contemporary cage fights, televised and increasingly popular, while not constituting carnivals of death, nevertheless offer a glimpse into the excitement and lust for blood reported from the arena spectacles of antiquity. The gradual, limited, and in global perspective, painfully slow outlawing of certain types of cruelty has, for instance, resulted in 37 countries protecting children by law from all types of corporal punishment, including corporal punishment in the home. The corporal punishment of adults, as well as torture and other forms of cruel treatment, are, of course, also illegal in most countries. But children are a kind of litmus test, I would say, for this kind of process, historical process. The kind of Machiavellian logic that advocates cruelty for the sake of public benefit, however, may turn out to be impossible to eradicate. The reason is twofold: the nature of the state, the polis, and the nature of humans, anthropos, as corporeal beings. Now this, I'm an anthropologist, so saying this is in anthropology like swearing in the church. Exactly. For states, violence is a necessary condition, for example, when it comes to enforcing existing laws. The states that outlawed corporal punishment of children might need to enforce the law using violence. There's a kind of paradox here, if you understand what I'm trying to get at. But law enforcement or military operations, imprisonment, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence are conducted by human beings. And human beings are not entirely rational, at least not in the sense Horkheimer and Adorno believed Juliet to be. Human beings, and here we are back at the beginning, are prey to the biochemistry of their unconscious. For the perpetrator, as well as for the spectator, cruelty can be a rewarding experience, which is something that we tend to shy away from because it makes us ourselves feel uncomfortable. In Latin, the perpetrator was an admissor, someone who allows him or herself to do a thing, which I think is a very nice way of putting it. You allow yourself to do something horrible. Another type of perpetrator was the commissor, someone who actively or passively took part in cruelty, for instance, by watching the cruel treatment of others. As Lactantius, advisor to the first Christian Roman emperor Constantine I, put it, one who is a spectator in the slaughters of gladiators is no less sprinkled with blood than those who shed it. Lactantius wrote this because he was concerned with guilt. But even if we put aside the question of guilt, Lactantius' statement makes sense in reference to a different context. Perpetrators and onlookers can both find pleasure in cruelty. With legal restrictions, institutionalized control mechanisms, and certain forms of internalized discipline, these days referred to as behavior modification, states and other institutions of power try to curb cruel behavior. At the same time, the asymmetries of power never cease to provide opportunities for cruelty. So, in other words, cruelty and its containment coexist in the same regulatory arrangements. Such insights ought to discourage us from objecting to torture, child abuse, Such insights ought not discourage us from objecting to torture, child abuse, carnivals of death, capital punishment, genocide, and so on. But we need to acknowledge the presence in all of this of the human unconscious with its bendings and windings. We also must take into consideration the historically contingent nature of our aversion to cruelty. As a result, we should resist the temptation to glorify the victims, which is easily done. We can think of examples in European history, Montesquieu with the Jews, Dickens with children, Hawthorne with women. And the reason we should resist this urge is that they, the victims, too, live in the unconscious where rewards of arousal and pleasure linger. Now let me say something about these two photos and why I put them up there. They are a kind of biographical symbol of why I'm concerned with these issues. The left image is from, these are prisoners that were liberated at the concentration camp of Buchenwald, and one of them could have been my father's father, who was in Buchenwald, because of his inobedience and to the system. And the story of his fate has, of course, I heard this tale told since I was a little child. And over the years, I've wondered more and more about this whole issue of survival, of guilt, not guilt, what you had to do to survive, you know, all those things that you probably already know. The right image is of a street. This is the Berlin Wall. In this street is where I grew up. So my window faced the wall. We were at the bottom floor. And of course, people were trying to escape and were killed. 1 minute. Yeah. So again, here of course the whole issue of guilt and perpetration and victimhood was again actualized, because after the fall of the wall, some of the people who shot people trying to escape East Germany were persecuted. But they, of course, claimed that I followed the law. And they were right. They followed the law. I mean, they didn't do anything illegal. Well, food for thought. So, thank you.